Hello, hello! I'm here today to talk to you about some rolls of film that went wrong and what I've learned from each of those rolls. A roll of film going wrong is not necessarily a bad thing. You may learn something, you may learn a new technique, you may learn something about your camera that you didn't know before. There are many ways that you can use that to your advantage. And so I want to take you through I'm going to take you through 8 rolls of film that I've shot, what went wrong and what I've learned from it. I'm going to talk through these in roughly chronological order because there are some big changes in my knowledge that happened along the way. So the first roll of film I'm going to talk about is one that I shot through my Exa 1C, which is a 35mm camera. I bought this off of eBay with condition unknown, really. I think they'd sold it as like spares and repairs. They probably paid £5 to £10 for it. But I took it on holiday, a very silly way to test a camera, but I took it on holiday, loaded with some colour film. And this was at a time when I didn't develop my own film. I had a lab do it, and I rarely looked at the actual negatives. I just looked at the scans that I was provided by the lab. So when I saw the first set of scans, all I could see was that the images overlapped. I couldn't see why, what had happened, or anything like that. And it was only a few years down the line that I actually got the negatives out on the light box and realised that there was a theme of how the images overlapped. They overlapped in threes. I wrote a full article about it on 35mmC, which I'll link down below if you're interested in that particular camera and that particular story. But for the purpose of this video, what I'm going to say is that I saw how the overlapping worked. I then tested another roll of film to see if it happened again, and it did. It was very exactly overlapping 3 images, then a normal break, and then the next 3 images, and then a normal break. I have no idea why there's this weird rule of 3 with this camera, but that's how it worked. So I loaded up a roll of black and white, and I enjoyed trying to use that overlap to my advantage, but I only knew about this because I'd looked at the negatives. The lab had scanned in sort of a traditional 16:9 ratio, because that's what people want normally from 35mm negatives. And yeah, so it was only when I went back that I saw I had almost like a panoramic way of photographing. So the next one I'm going to talk about is the Panorama Wide Pick. Now this is a toy camera, it's fully plastic. There are no sort of manual functions, but there's also no automation as such. It's not doing any light metering. You load a roll of film, you press the shutter button, it has a fixed aperture, fixed shutter speed. And whilst these are sort of advertised as being simple cameras, the first time I shot it, I didn't know enough about exposure. I didn't have enough experience, I think I would say, to put a roll of film in and then judge the lighting conditions as to whether any image would actually be captured. So most of my roll of film was too dark to capture anything at all, let alone even just a very dark image. So I thought I didn't like the camera, I put it to one side. And then when I started my toy camera project, I got it out, tested it, and this was long enough later that I had a lot more knowledge of light metering and a lot more experience in judging the lighting conditions. And so I actually had a lot of fun shooting that camera and getting some pretty decent images. Yes, there are still some that aren't great. It's still just a cheap plastic camera with a plastic lens, but to be honest, that suits my shooting style anyway. So roll 3. This one chronologically is perhaps a little fluid. So the Pentacon 6 camera is was my first 120 camera. I own that for the Exa 1C and the Panorama Wide Pick. But essentially what we have in this camera is various issues that I had no idea about. There was some spacing issues which improved mostly through use. The camera had not been used for a while, and so every now and then you'd have a skipped frame or something like that. But I had no idea. I also later discovered, after learning more about my cameras in general, that the Pentacon 6, if one of the shutter speeds starts to go, or if any of the shutter speeds start to go, I should say, it will usually start with the 1/125 speed, which is the flash sync speed. And again, I only knew that because I decided I needed to get to know the cameras that I was using better, you know, years after having first started using them. Errors where I thought it was me doing something wrong, either in my light metering or whatever, that had caused issues on the final image, actually turned out to be errors in the camera. Role number 4. So my first develop, again, I did some articles for 35mmC about my experiences with starting to home develop. I had done a 1-day workshop on film developing, which had gone perfectly well. So I thought I could do it at home myself. Well, a couple of years later. It wasn't immediately after. But with that first roll of film, I struggled to load that into the developing tank, and I spent so long attempting it. I had my dark bag, but the problem was I had spent so long there and it was getting really hot and sweaty. It was the middle of summer. It was getting really hot and sweaty in the bag. Everything was sticking. Everything was getting stuck. So in the end, I started taking my arms out, or I noticed that there was quite a lot of gap where the bag is supposed to be tight around your arm. Ultimately, a lot of light was getting into the dark bag and the whole roll came out black because I'd spent so long letting light into it, basically. So that came out completely blank, but we live and learn. And then my second develop, this was so unfortunate, but my second home develop, I hadn't loaded the camera correctly. Again, this is, learning some of the best techniques with your cameras. This is about getting to know your equipment. That was shot through my Xenon CX, which is a very standard manual camera. So basically anything that you shoot, the Pentax K1000 series, I've got the Pentax Me Super, Eve has the Canon F1, like anything like this with interchangeable lenses. There is a way of loading where you can feel not only can you feel the tension and you can see the numbers moving up, but you can feel it in your rewind button as well. See that it's loaded properly, which I didn't know about at the time. There are plenty of videos on how to load cameras, so I won't add to that conversation. I will just sort of promote other video creators, other content creators. But yeah, so essentially I hadn't loaded the camera properly. I went through what I thought was a roll of film, rewound it as normal, because I think at that point it's kind of hard to know whether you've loaded it correctly. Got it into the developing tank, all fine, much better on the second time with a bit of practice, but then got out a completely blank roll of film, but for a different reason, in that none of it was exposed. It was all just bare film. So that was frustrating. Again, we live and learn. Roll 6. So I purchased a Fujica Mini, which is my first ever half frame camera. I shot my roll of film. It has its an internal light meter. I say an internal light meter, it doesn't do any of the settings for you. You just have to change the dials until you're all aligned. So I shot through that, and I'd never shot half frame because to me, 72 frames is daunting. I like shooting medium format because I like having 12 shots on a roll. Yeah, I got through my 72 frames, developed the film, only to discover that once again I had a completely black roll of film. Essentially, it's got a shutter issue. The camera doesn't work properly. So that's gone back to, or will go back when I finally get around to doing it. That's gone back to Max by Cameras by Max, who will fix that for me. Roll 7. This one is harking back to Eve's video on fixing her camera. She asked me to help her test her camera. We shot a roll of film through it, and essentially we can see that there are definite light leaks coming through. I also wonder whether there is a shutter issue because of how the light leaks are affecting the film. But Eve has gone on to fix the light seals herself. They had essentially completely disintegrated, and she's now testing the camera to see if that has improved things. But we'll see if there is also a shutter issue. But yeah, so again, it's about knowing your camera. But another thing where she possibly would not have known what the issue was if we didn't develop our own film, if we didn't look at the negatives ourselves and do the scanning ourselves, she wouldn't have known. She might have thought that she was the issue. She might have thought that the lab were not developing properly. Which certainly went through my mind before I did my own developing, was that when there were occasions where a film came out completely useless, whether it was them or not. Sorry, labs. And then finally, roll 8. This one is my Pentax Me Super. This is my first ever film camera, the one that I was given by my dad, which was his when we were kids. This one is showing signs of light leaks. And so it really, I think, to be honest, it hasn't been serviced. Even after it had been sat in the loft, I didn't get it serviced. And this one is also going to Max by Cameras by Max, who does camera repair and servicing, as an offering on their website. So I'm going to use them to do my servicing for me. Basically, I wanted to do it myself, but I have a few cameras that I wanted to practice on, but I haven't got the time. I really want to, but I just haven't got the time. So I'm, rather than it sitting languishing and getting any worse than it is, I've decided to send that off to Max to be serviced and corrected. So yeah, looking forward to getting that back and being able to use that one again. Let's talk about some of the resources. Learning how your cameras work. I love the Ansel Adams series of books, but there's the camera, which this is the first one, the negative and the print, and yes, there's going to be a lot more detail than you need in these, but if you like learning from books, as I do, these are one of the best that you can get for getting to know how your equipment works, and then going on to the negative and the print, you know, how the different things work and how to get the best out of it. Otherwise, there are certainly some amazing YouTube videos and tutorials out there. As I say, with my Pentacon 6, it turns out the Pentacon 6 is quite, I don't want to say unique, but like a specific camera, and there are specific quirks with it. There is a fantastic YouTuber. I say fantastic, like it's just someone who loves what he does. He knows the Pentacon 6, and so he's a really good one to watch. I'll link his YouTube in the description, and hopefully we'll have it flash up because I can't remember it off the top of my head, but I use that to get to know my Pentacon 6. Generally, if I'm using any other camera, I will look at videos that are specific to it just to get a feel for it. As I say, there are some great videos out there on sort of your standard SLRs, which apply to most of them and which would be really handy to use. So another resource that I love, and this is the Darkroom Handbook by Michael Langford. This has a range of topics in it. I got this when I started setting up my home darkroom, but this has been amazing for developing my own negatives, developing my own film, because it goes through different troubleshooting, so different issues that you might see, from fogged images to underexposed images when it comes to colour and colour shifts, things like that. It will help you troubleshoot what's gone wrong. So this has proved enormously helpful. So I would say one of the best things that I did for myself to improve my photography was learn to develop my own film and then scan it myself. I wouldn't even say that printing in the darkroom has improved my photography any more than the act of developing the film. That is what really forced me to look at the negatives and to decide whether it was the developing process, something in camera, or something else that caused the issue. Those are my recommendations. Those are some examples where my film has gone wrong. I hope you enjoyed this. I hope it was educational, somewhat educational. But yeah, thank you.